Session. I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan. I'm a professor of sociology at the Catholic University of America, and this session is going to look at innovation and religion, promises, pitfalls, and paths forward. This is an initiative that is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust. It's a philanthropic foundation that is trying to develop a grant-making strategy around the theme of innovation. I'm going to put that in scare quotes because part of what we're trying to figure out is whether that is even the right concept. But so what is it that this term is referring to, and is it valuable for making sense of religious change, adaptation, renewal, et cetera, and the sorts of things that our panelists today are going to talk about. So let me just say a few framing comments for the sort of thing we're trying to do, and then I'll introduce the panelists and we'll get started. So innovation is everywhere. I mean, you go to an airport bookstore, you're bound to see a few books on innovation. It's hard for, if any of you all here are doctoral students, if you do a PhD in any program, it's hard to be able to get through the program without making some claim about how your research is innovative. I mean, so it's become a universal judgment of worth, which is very strange because just about 100 years ago it was universally a pejorative. There was, and even longer, I think, people like think of King Edward VI in England issued a proclamation that thou shalt not innovate, right? So it was seen as something that was not just a pejorative, but something objectively wrong. So what is it that we're talking about here? There's an implication in the concept of innovation that we're talking about something that is somehow new, or at least different. And that always implies that there's a context in which this thing that we're talking about is new or different, right? But novelty alone is not enough. You can talk about inventions, you can talk about things that sort of emerge. It seems that when we talk about innovation, we often mean that there's some kind of significant way in which the thing we're talking about is new. And that could be disruptive, and now this is another buzzword in the management literature and the technology literature, disruptive innovation. It's not just significant, but kind of, upends the state of a field. And the idea is it's more than a marginally perceptible change, right? And also, not only is it new in some significant sense, but it is diffused. It is adopted broadly enough by some community beyond the initial innovators to form maybe some shared legitimized standards or practices. So there's something social about that dimension of innovation, that it's not just some new idea I have that's not enough for it to be an innovation. It's got to somehow travel. And then it seems to me some relevant community is needed to judge that this sense of innovation, this thing that we have, facilitates a deeper sense of, and this is innovation in the sense of religion that I'm talking about, and some sense of fullness or some sense of what Charles Taylor would call cosmic connection. So what that means is it has something to do with the overall goal of the religious or spiritual quest, right, of a particular community. So it is somehow contributing to a deeper sense of whatever it is that community aspires to, that community of faith. So perceived as meaningfully better than the status quo in getting us to that goal, whatever that is, whether it's more people in our pews or whether it is a better understanding of some kinds of religious teachings, etc. And so it can highlight creative agency in faith communities and religious institutions. It can highlight a process of adaptation, diffusion, legitimation, etc. But there's also some baggage that it comes with. I mean, it really does come out of the Western capitalist business technology context. And so what does that bring with it? And what are the blind spots that might be associated with that? It often seems like there's some underlying assumptions about a normative assumption of improvement or effectiveness, right? When you say something is innovative, you kind of, I mean, on the one hand, it seems like innovation is less normatively loaded than something like progress, which is very obviously good. Innovation, you might say, well, this is a good innovation or a bad innovation or helpful or unhelpful, legitimate, illegitimate, but still you typically are smuggling in some assumption of improvement or effectiveness. And it's somewhere between the vagueness of change and the kind of normative, kind of, loaded nature of a concept of progress. It's usually somehow got pragmatic connotations, like it's solving some problem for someone. And as I said, it's become a universal criterion of worth, right? And so that is the context in which we are thinking about this term today. And so how do we understand innovation in the context of religion? How do religious communities rethink tradition? Or this conference's theme is about living tradition. And so what does it mean to rethink tradition in moments of crisis or moral challenge? How do we keep a tradition alive so it's not ossified? How do traditions discern what are legitimate and illegitimate forms of change? are there alternative concepts besides innovation that can get at that better, right? Maybe reform, renewal, ressourcement, et cetera, that are more accurate and helpful? Are there unintended consequences of innovations, et cetera? So a lot of questions could emerge, maybe, fruitfully from a focus on innovation. But maybe that's not the right concept, and maybe we need to think about something else if we want to understand these sorts of themes. So that's what our panel today is going to talk about, and I will introduce our my excellent colleagues here who have been gracious enough to accept our invitation. So we're going to start first with Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, who is the Crowley Professor of Islamic Studies and Theology in the Department of Theology at Notre Dame. And his most recent book is Christianity and the Quran, forthcoming from Yale. And he also runs a successful YouTube channel exploring the Quran and the Bible, and serves on the Vatican Dicastery of Interreligious Relations with Muslims. Then Dr. Sarah Shortall is an intellectual and cultural historian of modern Europe with a particular interest in modern France, Catholic thought, and the relationship between religion and politics. Her first book, Soldiers of God in a Secular World, Catholic Theology and 20th Century French Politics, from Harvard University Press, received several awards. Dr. John Sikorsky is an assistant teaching professor in the Business Ethics and Society program at the Mendoza College of Business, and directs the minor in Business and the Common Good and teaches at the intersection of theology, business, and political economy. And then Dr. Atalia Omer is professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the Keough School of Global Affairs. And she earned her PhD in religion, ethics, and politics from the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard. And her latest book is Decolonizing Religion and Peace Building. So the format for this panel is a little bit unusual. We're going to have shorter initial presentations from our panelists, and then depending on the time, hopefully we'll have 10-minute interventions. I'm going to throw some questions to you all in the audience because we're not really innovation experts. The point is to think through this together. So we're going to innovate a little bit in the format of this session and see how that works. So without further ado, let me invite Gabriel to get started.
Thank you for the applause. I don't deserve it, but good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. Thanks, Brandon, for the generous introduction, and everyone, the panelists, for gathering together. Pretty cool that we have kind of diverse disciplines and perspectives, and we'll be approaching the question of innovation, in these diverse ways, which hopefully will be fruitful for our conversation afterwards. My background is in theology and Islamic studies. I teach here at Notre Dame in the theology department, so I'm going to be speaking about innovation in theology, really in Islamic studies. So most of my work is in Islam, although as a Catholic, I also think about Catholic theology quite a bit. So I'm actually going to start there. When I came to Notre Dame in 2003, there was kind of a reputation for the theology department as being a place that sort of complicates things for undergraduates, Catholics who arrive at Notre Dame. And there was sort of an assumption out there that, a lot of them came with simplistic, maybe even fundamentalist attitudes towards religion, and they would go to theology class, not for catechism, not for the basic doctrine of the church, but to have a theology professor show them, it's actually more complicated. Don't take things so literally. Don't be so slavish in your obedience to some church teaching on this or that. People would joke that they couldn't take the Bible literally because they didn't read it. But nevertheless, that was kind of the vibe. And it's something I still bring up with my students in my theology classes here at Notre Dame, just to remind them that theology is the intellectual engagement with the data of the faith. So it's quite different than like an indoctrination where you're just being told the Bible says this, the church says that. It's instead your response, your rational response to the faith. So, even in the Catholic world, theology can be complicated because it could be a way to depart from or to innovate in regard to the traditional teaching of the church or the teaching of the Bible. In Islam, things are even more interesting when it comes to the question of innovation. Oftentimes, Muslim scholars speak of innovation, particularly in the context of doctrine, but also practice. And, most Muslim scholars, even from different schools, would say, listen, innovation in Arabic, it's bid'ah, is forbidden when it comes to religion. In Arabic, they would say deen. So anything that has to do with deen, which could be doctrine or practice, there you cannot innovate. But in things like technology and other sorts of things, medicine, you can innovate. That's interesting. Now, there are, however, Muslims who disagree over whether theology itself is an innovation. So I'd like to speak for about 5 minutes, 6 minutes about that debate. Why do Muslims disagree over whether theology is an innovation? And I'm going to introduce a couple of figures, one from the present day, sort of almost, and then a couple from the medieval Islamic tradition. The Saudi figure, scholar Ibn al-Uthaymeen, dies in 2001, is sort of recognized as one of the the big stars of the Salafi world, which is kind of a more conservative Sunni world from the end of the 20th century. And he has a well-known text, which is a commentary on a medieval creed. The creed itself is called Al-Aqidah Al-Wasitiyyah by someone named Ibn Taymiyyah. We'll get back to Ibn Taymiyyah, but let's focus first on Ibn al-Uthaymeen. In the course of his commentary, one of the more controversial things he does is he argues that the schools of standard Sunni Muslim theology, don't need to know all these terms, I think it's just the general issue we're talking about. So the most famous schools are the Ash'ariyah and the Maturidiyah. He says that they are not properly defined as Sunnis. And he's even more controversial than that because he begins his discussion by citing a famous hadith or statement of the Prophet Muhammad, in which the Prophet says, "My community will be divided into 73 groups. All of them shall enter hellfire, except for one." So Ibn Uthaymeen says, well, who would be this one group that's saved? He then continues his discussion of the hadith of the Prophet. Someone asks Muhammad, "Which is it, O Messenger of God?" And Muhammad responds, "It is that which is upon the like of what I and my companions are upon." So Ibn Uthaymeen then continues the thought experiment and says, well, which group is actually upon the like of that which Muhammad and his companions are upon? It's certainly not the theologians. And he says this principally because of the way in which theologians use categories and even Arabic words which are not found in the Quran or the Hadith or the traditions, narrations connected to the early Muslims. So Ibn Uthaymeen says, now I'm quoting him, the Ash'aris, for example, and the Maturidis are not included among the people of the Sunnah because they oppose them in what the Prophet and his companions said regarding the attributes of God. Now, if we go into the attributes, it get complicated, but basically they have theological views about God which are not found among the companions. He concludes, therefore, we say the Salaf, which, surprise, means his own group, are the people of the Sunnah, meaning they are the Sunnis. Okay, so I'm going to circle back then to the earlier debate in the medieval period and then make a conclusion quickly about sort of the contemporary relevance of all of this. I mentioned that his treatise is a commentary on the creed of someone named Ibn Taymiyyah, who dies in 1328, so we're going back a few centuries. Ibn Taymiyyah was engaged in all sorts of debates in his day, including against the Muslim theologians, most famously against an earlier figure who died in the early 13th century named Fakhruddin ar-Razi. Among other things, Ibn Taymiyyah criticized the view of the earlier guy, Fakhruddin ar-Razi, that God is not in a place and God has no body. Why would he criticize this view? Because the Quran says, for example, that the Lord is above the people in Quran 16:50. The Quran also says in multiple different places, God, basically it says Ar-Rahman, which means the merciful one, but God sat on the throne. So the theologian would say, well, these are symbolic, we can interpret these in the deeper sense. Ibn Taymiyyah says, trust the words that God gave us. If God is above, then he must be somewhere. If he's sitting on a throne, then he must really have sat on a throne. Fakhruddin ar-Razi had said, anticipating that sort of argument, that there are all sorts of intellectual problems if you locate God in space or time. So I won't get into those probably. There are other sessions at this conference where this is spoken about. And he concludes by saying, like, the logical conclusion of this will be recognized, quote, this is Razi, as false by all rational people. Ibn Taymiyyah responds in two ways. First, by affirming that the earlier Muslim community, that is Muhammad and his companions, did not use the terms that Razi uses to advance his argument. He gives specific examples. The word body, jism, the word spatial extension, tahayyuz, the word substance, jawhar, and so on and so forth, are not used in the Quran or the Hadith in regard to God. And so he says, the leaders of Islam do not use innovated and disputed terms, and so on and so forth. Now, just one added note about Ibn Taymiyyah, I'll be done in about 2 minutes here. He actually does refute Razi in another way, which is to come up with a rational explanation of how God could be a body, and I'll spare you his explanation, but he argues ultimately that God is a large and indivisible existent being that is above and surrounds the world in which we live. And he uses a lot of the same intellectual tools that Razi does to make his case for God really being an existent being with a sort of body in our world. Okay, just a conclusion here, and then I'll cede the microphone to others. There are really two issues here for Ibn Uthaymeen, the modern Saudi, and for the earlier debate, Ibn Taymiyyah and those guys in the medieval period, when it comes to innovation. The first is the accusation of Ibn Uthaymeen that, unlike, I guess, what happens with graduate students, it is bad and not good to innovate because Muhammad himself set an example that is to be followed. There's a famous verse in the Quran in which God says, I have completed your religion. It's often thought to be maybe the last verse in the Quran or one of the last. So if it's complete, innovation, therefore, will be deviation. But there's a second point here as well, which is the danger of innovating for the faith of those who innovate. So Ibn Uthaymeen and Ibn Taymiyyah before him says that asking questions about how and why will ultimately lead to unbelief. Probably some conservative folks back in the day would make a similar argument about Notre Dame theology. Don't complicate things too much for our sons and daughters at Notre Dame. There's a nice saying from another Muslim scholar named Ibn Aqil, who says, the old person's path is safer than the path of the theologians. The Arabic word is ajuz. Old person's path, he means simple faith, just trusting in what you receive from your tradition. In the end, however, Ibn Taymiyyah does use rational tools of theology to defend his reading of the Quran. So even Ibn Taymiyyah, in his rationalism, finds that innovation is inevitable. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this wonderful invitation and to everyone for attending. As Brandon indicated, I'm an intellectual historian of modern Europe, but I do focus on the history of French Catholic theology in particular in the 20th century. And so I'll speak to the question of innovation as it applies to 20th century Catholic thought and theology in particular. And the first thing I should say is that innovation is not really a concept or a category that is used by the actors that I study, because I think all of them would be a bit skeptical about the implication of novelty or discontinuity that's implied by that term. And so they would probably prefer terms like renewal, retrieval, reform even, properly understood. But they were absolutely, I think, grappling with the problem of how to innovate in the Catholic tradition and how to bring the church into the modern world. So what are the kinds of things that can and should change as times change? And how can change be conceived in such a way as to maintain, or at least appear to maintain, some continuity with a much older tradition? And this is, of course, the central question of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. So I think it's worth starting there. And the great historian of church councils, John O'Malley, identified three main models for change at the council, or how change was understood. The first was aggiornamento. This is usually the term that is associated with Vatican II. It is usually translated as updating, but you could understand it as modernization, maybe even adaptation, in light of the signs of the times. And so a document like Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, starts with a discussion of the signs of the time, of the contemporary moment, and then proceeds from there in an inductive method to develop conclusions about church teaching. So that's a pretty new approach. And there are those who take a fairly radical approach to this after the council, who think that this approach calls for a kind of constant overcoming or permanent invention in light of the changing circumstances and as the signs of the times change. A second model is a much older one, the development of doctrine. And this one implies kind of an evolution in a continuous line, or the unfolding of something that is already latent in the tradition. It implies a much more incremental and kind of gradual approach to change. And then finally, the logic of ressourcement, or return to the sources, or retrieval. And this would seem like the most traditional or backwards-looking approach, but part of what O'Malley wants to suggest is that this can be potentially the most radical approach of all, and indeed it is used to underwrite some of the most important innovations at Vatican II, from liturgical reform to the teaching on religious freedom and episcopal collegiality, which were some of the more controversial teachings. And so the point is that ressourcement and aggiornamento, or modernization or innovation, are not necessarily at odds and often sort of imply each other. And so the figures that I work on in the French context were, this was absolutely central to their worldview, and many of them were very, very involved in writing the documents of the council. People like Yves Congar, Henri de Lubac, Jean Danielou. These are figures associated with the Nouvelle Théologie, or New Theology, that developed in France in the 1930s and 1940s. And they're really the pioneers of this project of ressourcement, of returning to the sources that they felt had been overshadowed by the dominance of neo-scholasticism since the 19th century. So, when they were being trained as priests at the turn of the 20th century, what they were taught were these manuals, basically, that were written in the 19th century and were themselves based on 16th century commentators on Thomas Aquinas. So there's several steps removed from the sources. And so especially for the Jesuits associated with this movement, they really wanted to go back to the church fathers, especially, and to scripture, to recover some of these older models that had been forgotten or overshadowed by the dominance of scholasticism. But they were also very much in dialogue with modern philosophy. And part of what I try to show in my book is that they made crucial contributions to developments in French intellectual life in this period, from phenomenology and existentialism to Hegelianism, to debates about Marxism. And that what I try to show is that this isn't necessarily a contradiction, that those two impulses are not necessarily at odds. And this is something that Jean Danielou makes explicit in his, what's often seen as the manifesto of the Nouvelle Théologie in 1946, this article he writes called The Present Orientations of Religious Thought. And he argues there that ressourcement is actually what will allow Catholic thought to engage in dialogue with the modern world. And that it's actually by turning back to these oldest sources that we can paradoxically bring the church up to date. And so the reason he thinks this is he argues that questions of history, for example, questions of subjectivity, are central to the church fathers and also to modern philosophy. And here he has in mind Marxism and existentialism in particular, which were the two kind of dominant intellectual families, let's say, right after World War II. But these are absent from scholasticism. And so he argues that the church fathers are in many ways more contemporary, even though they're much older. So there's a way in which they seem much more contemporary. And so that's why this project of ressourcement and of modernization, of engagement with the modern world, always go hand in hand for them. And that's precisely the principle that underwrites many of the documents of Vatican II, in part because it allows the council to make changes and to modernize while claiming continuity with the past. And I think this is equally true of the kind of more progressive voices, let's say, as they're often seen at the council, and some of the more traditional ones. They're both committed to this double pair of ressourcement and aggiornamento. So, there are other models I can speak about of how change is understood in the church, but for now, let me just conclude by saying that even though innovation is not an actor's category for these figures, that doesn't mean that it's not a useful category for thinking about their work, or that it can't be applied to them, because there's no reason why we need to necessarily adopt their categories as our own. But I do think that any understanding of innovation in religious thought needs to be able to account for the way that such thought tends to anchor any movement for change or innovation in an appeal to tradition and the past. So it needs to be able to grapple with this kind of double temporality that is operative in religious thought. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. So I hope in this discussion to treat of innovation in a very narrow sense. So I'm not going to talk about doctrine, liturgy, or practices. There's plenty of Cardinal Newman sessions at this conference. But I want to begin with something Brandon alluded to, namely innovation is something judged by some relevant community as facilitating deeper sense of fullness, where novelty alone is not enough, but something that contributes in some significant way to society. And I'm going to do so through the lens of formation, fraternity, and flourishing. And I'm going to actually talk more about ad extra. So it turns out that I think the church documents talk more about innovation when regarding engaging the world, as opposed to innovation within the church. In fact, as far as I know, innovation only appears once in the Catholic Catechism in paragraph 1135, and that has to do with the sacraments. So in considering innovation, though, a first difficulty arises. I'd like to take as my starting point St. Thomas Aquinas' discussion of God's providence in the Summa, where he cites the Book of Wisdom. She reacheth from end to end mightily and orders all things sweetly. So Aquinas agrees with Moses Maimonides that human beings are subject to the providence of God, but he adds that providence further includes immediate providence over all things. First, God foreordains things towards an end, but he also executes this order through government. As to the first type of providence, God's perfection enables him to hold all things, even the smallest, in his intellect, and he assigns to all things the power to produce specific effects. Ecclesiastes reminds us what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there's nothing new under the sun. As creator, God willed everything into being ex nihilo and continues to sustain everything in being, such that if at any moment he were to cease doing so, all would cease to exist within his providential plan. Then everything that has been, is, or ever will be is already accomplished, is being accomplished, or will come to be. Time itself, after all, is a creation and exists only because it's in God's eternal present. So insofar as we understand innovation as the bringing about of something new, the creation ex nihilo of something that does not exist, or the autonomous human determination of the course of things, then we do not innovate. Only God innovates, he creates, and he recreates. He makes all things new. Or in the language of the New Testament, Jesus declares the inbreaking of the kingdom of God into human history and reveals himself in the fullness of time as Christ, the Son of the living God, who accomplishes the salvation of the human race when he stretches out his hands on the cross and utters, "It is finished." So we might ask, what else is there to accomplish? How can we make anything new if Christ makes all things new? What more is needful than the one thing necessary? If all is in God's hands, if God governs all, if God redeems all, then we have a problem, because what does that leave us to do? This is where Aquinas' second notion of providence comes in. He argues, quote, there are certain intermediaries of God's providence, for he governs things inferior by superior, not on account of any defect in his power, but by reason of the abundance of his goodness. So the dignity of causality is imparted even to creatures. So God's goodness imparts dignity. It is not we who have chosen to act, to make, to invent, or to innovate. It is God's goodness that has imparted this power to us. Thus, expressions of our agency, intellect, freedom, leading to innovation, are truly ours while existing within the scope of divine providence. For God has willed that the order he created contain things that do not happen of necessity, but also happen through the action of secondary efficient causes. This, of course, is one of the main lessons of the first chapters of Genesis, a theonomous anthropocentrism in which men and women are given the earth, a created order of which they are a part, yet also are called to keep and till and subdue and have dominion. Of course, here navigating the difficult path between sort of technocratic paradigm, domination, and the reduction of human beings to insignificant specks in the universe. Humans are co-workers in the vineyard of the Lord, collaborators in God's providence. The Catholic tradition recognizes the primacy of providence and the noble calling and task to work within this providential order as human creatures to carry out the work of God. God's goodness imparts a dignity to the creature who responds to God's self-communication. As John Paul II argues in one of his last apostolic letters, which is actually on the rapid development of technology, which he wrote 2 months before he died, he says, the human being is created in the image and likeness of God in order to embrace divine revelation and to enter into loving dialogue with him, and it reaches its perfection in the Word made flesh. Humans, by virtue of the kind of creatures they are, self-determining, self-conscious, called to live and love in a communion of persons through a sincere gift of self, must approach all temporal activities in this light. So how to approach innovation as a fruit of human labor, as participatory action in God's creation? I could digress here into a robust theology and philosophy of work, but I don't want to do that. So I want to begin with the Catechism's passage about the role of the laity in 899. Lay believers are in the front line of the church life. For them, the church is the animating principle of human society. Therefore, they in particular ought to have an ever clearer consciousness not only of belonging to the church, but of being the church. Pope St. Paul VI argues, quote, they must confess that the kingdom of God begun here below in the church of Christ is not of this world whose form is passing, yet they must also contribute each according to his vocation and means to the welfare of the earthly city, especially the poorest and the most unfortunate, end quote. In their work, in their making of new technologies, goods, services, methods, programs, we can think both intra-pastoral programs here or extra, confronting challenges, assessing economic, political, social life. Christians need to be first aware of the challenges before them, and second, to not allow these challenges to paralyze them with fear of working for formation, fraternity, and flourishing. We can talk about some of the challenges in the discussion. I brought a whole list, but it's more interesting to hear everyone's thoughts on that. So I want to talk about these three F's. Christians need to first always judge innovation in light of formation, understood here both in terms of the formation of the human person and the formation of culture. Innovations create entire cultures. One can think here of social media. Such innovations form personality and conscience. They affect the interpretation and structuring of effective relationships, the coming and elaboration and diffusion of cultural phenomena, and the development of social, political, and economic life. So are we forming cultures worthy of the human person? Or are we doing the opposite? Here's an interesting quote from one of the co-founders of LinkedIn, a prominent venture capitalist. He says, quote, I invest in one or more of the 7 deadly sins. This is Reid Hoffman. Whether it's sloth, vanity, wrath, or any of the other deadly sins, they're natural inclinations found among people everywhere. You're not trying to amplify them, but you hook into that level of emotional infrastructure, then actually, in fact, you can get a very broad product. End quote. Is that a culture of human formation? We're all aware of bias and algorithms, behavioral nudges, data collection, undermining privacy rights. The peddling of pornography is all made possible through innovations. Are these innovations forming a truly human culture or contributing to a destructive anti-culture? Sam Altman, another innovator. You all know who he is, I hope, right? Maybe not. Maybe it's a good thing you don't. OpenAI founder. He seems at least cognizant of this question. He says, quote, look, I don't sleep well at night. There's a lot of stuff I feel a lot of weight on, but probably nothing more than the fact that every day hundreds of millions of people talk to our model, and I don't actually worry about us getting the big moral decisions wrong. Maybe we'll get those wrong too, but I worry what I lose sleep over is the very small decisions we make that affect hundreds of millions of people, end quote. Okay, precisely because of such questions, Gaudium et Spes points out, quote, the church desires to add light of revealed truth to mankind's store of experience, So the path which humanity has taken in recent times will not be a dark one, end quote. Formation of persons and culture must be at the forefront of considering how to approach innovation, both in and outside of the church. This formation will bring about dialogue and the second word I'm using here, fraternity. In the words of Communio et Progressio, quote, the wonderful technical inventions serve to build new relationships and fashion a new language which permits men to know themselves better and to understand one another more easily. Mutual understanding and shared ambition inclines them to justice, peace, goodwill, charity, mutual help, love, and in the end to communion, end quote. In order for such fraternity to be assumed and fostered, persons must be given the opportunity and ability to co-responsibly participate in the administration, use, benefits, and fruits of innovations. I think that's an important term when thinking in the church about co-responsibility. We've all seen in recent years the use of alliance between power and innovation to silence various forms of speech, whether questioning COVID policies, canceling critics of the invasion of Gaza, racial, religious bias, and AI. Such use of innovation cannot form cultures worthy of the human person, for they cut persons off from fraternity, which is ultimately found in common reference to truth, beauty, and goodness. Why do we work, after all? The Polish poet Cyprian Norwid wrote, "For beauty exists that we might be enticed to work, work that we might be resurrected." So a truly fraternal culture can be constituted only when we see our innovative work as constitutive of a non-instrumental, non-utilitarian culture that expresses the content of the human soul. The well-formed and properly ordered soul will produce a fraternal culture of openness and dialogue and truth and charity. The disordered soul will create cultures of chaos where the will to power and the thirst for profit and the lust for domination will rule the way we develop, use, and subordinate others to our innovations rather than subordinating ourselves to the cosmos, to the order of God's providentially ordered world. A good person brings forth a good store of goodness, but an evil person brings forth evil out of a store of evil. The philosopher Josef Tischner argues, quote, modern times brought about a deep crisis of interpersonal communication and increasing consciousness of isolation and helplessness. The other person is someone who might betray me. I think those words are still true 50 years later. So finally, if innovations serve to form human persons and human cultures and build fraternity, they will thus contribute to genuine human flourishing. Speaking of modern social media technologies, Pope John Paul II said, quote, the modern technologies increase to a remarkable extent the speed, quantity, and accessibility of communication, but they do not above all favor a delicate exchange which takes place between mind and mind, heart and heart, and which should characterize any communication at the service of solidarity and love. So for innovation to contribute to human flourishing, it needs to be put in its place, which includes consideration of equal access, symmetry of power, ex-ante commitments to human dignity and the common good, key terms, by the way, of Catholic social teaching, rejection of profit, prestige, and power as purpose is measured by metrics, circumscribe innovation within the moral law, and resist the technocratic paradigm that sees humans and creation as raw matter to be manipulated, dominated, mastered, and bent at will to further the ends of progress for progress's sake. So I'll just end with one quote from Pope Leo the 14th that he said 7 days ago. I think it's very relevant. And it's also not insignificant, as he himself mentioned, that he kind of sees our moment as an engagement with the rerum novarum today, right? He made explicit reference to that in his first speech to the cardinals shortly after his election. He says, quote, technological innovation can be a form of participation in the divine act of creation. As such, it carries an ethical and spiritual weight, for every design choice expresses a vision of humanity. Place technology at the service of evangelization and the integral development of every person. Such interdisciplinary collaboration embodies the dialogue between faith and reason, renewed in the digital epoch, and affirming that intelligence, whether artificial or human, finds its fullest meaning in love, freedom, and the relationship with God. That was his message to the builders of the AI Forum just 1 week ago. So I'll end with that. I think we could talk about formation, flourishing, and fraternity and the way the church can engage innovation. There's lots of positives and negatives there, but I hope that would bring about a good discussion. So thank you all.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you, Brandon, and also the brilliant co-panelist. And so I'm Atalia Omer. I'm the one keeping us from the stimulating conversation that will ensue. So I'm a scholar of religion, ethics, and politics, as Brandon said, and I'll be speaking, I've done a lot of kind of comparative work on the question of religion, political violence, and conflict transformation and peace building. But I will draw today, in my brief remarks, on my work specifically in the context of intra-Jewish contestation, and especially trying to kind of, and one operative concept that emerged from especially sociological and ethnographic work that I've done is of, in reference to the question of the concept of innovation, rather the operative concept is of reimagining what it means to be Jewish. And so, I guess I'm at a point in my career where I can see kind of through lines. One through line in my scholarship, I think, connects to the conversation today, and it's this notion of critical caretaking. This refers to just kind of like to telegraph it to the importance of the work of critique that is interdisciplinary, that is about denaturalizing what appears to be natural. It's a challenge to any kind of a discourse of authenticity, also in reference to tradition itself. But also recognizing that the act of critique in and of itself is not sufficient when you want to think constructively, also politically and historically. And so the caretaking dimension comes in, and that means that kind of invites hermeneutical work, interpretive work, a lot of digging up, digging up, and also the imaginative, and that connects to the innovative, kind of an ethics of relationality, because the work within the tradition is never in abstraction from political spaces, ethical spaces, because we are not, we live in communities that are not pure, to use a really horrible word. Okay, so critical caretaking is kind of a concept that I've worked with and has been helpful for me in illuminating. And so I will speak briefly on an earlier work that I've done, which was ethnographic and sociological, and was published in a book called Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians. It came out with the University of Chicago Press in 2019. It involved a lot of, again, ethnographic work with American Jews, who, and the, kind of the key question that I asked myself, or that initially brought me to this research was, well, first, how people disrupt kind of that discourse of authenticity that I referred to earlier. I mean, the question was very, very simple in a sense of what kind of processes go into people changing their affective loyalties, because so much of Judaism has become kind of conflated and reduced to worshipping a political project, a settler colonial political project. And so what my findings that involve also over 100 in-depth interviews and participant observation, different actions, with people across the spectrum in respect to their relationship or their questioning of the relationship between Judaism and Zionism, is that, again, one of the key findings that emerged for me is that process of reimagining is relational. It's by people being confronted directly by the realities of military occupation, of apartheid, settler colonialism, and that it's done in their name, so they feel a sense of direct responsibility. This is why the title of the book was Days of Awe, which is a reference to the terrible days in the beginning of the Jewish liturgical years of wrestling with sinfulness. And so there is a direct relationality in being confronted by what do I owe the other, and that becomes central to the process of reimagining and kind of digging into the tradition and recovering other traditions that were eclipsed by one particular dominant reading of Jewish history, Jewish meaning, the Jewish tradition. So it's relational, but also, so I trace in the book kind of the relationality and how it plays out, but it's also intersectional because it required for many of the American Jews that I engaged with, my interlocutors, to really think through, for instance, questions that I did. I mean, they kept using this notion of white privilege. So a lot of that they inhabit. So a lot of the process of this is where it connects to the critique, the critical dimension of the critical caretaking. There is a lot of kind of interrogation and thinking of how Jews became white, assimilated into whiteness, assimilated into kind of a civilizational discourse. So this also connects to the kind of a decolonial move of trying to rethink and re-understand and contextualize Jewish European modernity. And so this is one point that I wanted to kind of bring to the foreground. And it connects to kind of also my methodology, which has been, again, ethnographic, sociological, trying to understand how that process of reimagining happens through social movement spaces in conversation with other people. And so this is very important because often that the conversation becomes abstracted from the social, from the political, from the historical, from the kind of claims that other people put on you. And so this is something that I've been tracing, and also in the context of Jewish activists in Palestine, Israel right now, or in recent years, who are trying to rethink what it means to be Jewish in the space in Palestine, but not through kind of political, through settler colonial frame, and one of the so they have to dig through what is called the counter archives, and that also in terms of both the tradition, the kind of the hermeneutical, the layers of hermeneutics over centuries that were completely kind of like this basically eclipsed by a Zionist reading of Jewish history. And Jewish teleology, Jewish destiny, and so forth. And so there is a lot of, for instance, uncovering, excavating of what Jewish thinkers, sages, wrote and thought in 16th century Ottoman Palestine, in the city of Safed, for instance. And so I'm tracing how that kind of process of recovery then participate in the actual kind of like social movement that is emerging on the ground. So what is the relationship between the historical work, the philosophical work, the theological work, although theology is a problematic concept to transfer to that context, and how it kind of move people to act in different ways and to understand their own like meaning in the space in different through a different lens, how that process helps to disrupt the construct that became so naturalized of the Judeo-Christian by digging up actual like historic histories of the Judeo-Muslim, and what are the generative dimensions of this process. So I'm tracing that, which. In many respects, it kind of the image that people often operate with is of Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, and thinking of all the debris that are left in the process of progress. And it is about digging into the debris. So in the current context, in the current moment, with the total and utter destruction of Gaza, the genocide, kind of the argument is that you can't, that is emerging on the ground by people who are deeply immersed in the religious tradition, in the Jewish tradition, that you can think about, that there is no such thing as thinking about the Jewish tradition without also being accountable to the destruction of Gaza in the same way, the genocide in Gaza, in the same way that you cannot think of the Jewish tradition without thinking about the centrality of the destruction of the temples. In reference to the emergence and the life, the kind of the living histories of the tradition. So there is a lot of in thinking about innovation or critical caretaking. The key point that I want to highlight that emerged for me from my ethnographic work again is of the kind of the ethics of the political ethics of relationality. And how it plays out. So yeah, I'll stop with this. Thank you.
So I feel really bad for forcing you all to stick to 10 minutes. And I mean, there's so much richness in everything that each of you have shared. There's some really fascinating questions that also arise for me as I listen to you all. And one question, certainly in the context of innovation in religious communities, the past plays an outsized role, right? I mean, it is unlike sort of innovation, even the idea in the business world that innovation sort of somehow happens, out of whole cloth. I mean, that's not quite true. You're always recombining. You think of jazz musicians who are improvising, and they're always, you have to have some tradition against which you can improvise, and you without that kind of foundation, it makes no sense. But it seems like there are assumptions about the nature of the past, right? Is the past simple, or is the past complex? And it seems like, Gabriel, between the actors that you're engaging with, there's an assumption of the simplicity of the past, and therefore once we return, there is a purity that can be found in these ancient texts that can then obviate the need for theology or any kind of innovation, whereas in Natalia's case, the past is more complex than we've made it out to be, and there's a lot more there. And in Sarah's case, it seems like the return to the past is in order to make sense of this present condition and find somewhere in there categories, whether of human dignity and so on, that could help us reshape the path forward. And then John, you've given us some really important criteria for not just the source of innovation, but like the consequences. How do we judge whether this innovation is helpful not just for the sustaining of our religious tradition, but are there other criteria such as fraternity and flourishing that we need to take into account? Before I have so many questions for the panelists, but what I want to do actually is to throw open a question for everyone here. So I'll read this out to our panelists as well. I want to go back to this concept of innovation and interrogate it a little bit. So I want you to think of a case, and this could be a case that you all have already mentioned, but any case of what you would be willing to call a religious innovation or an innovation in religion. Right? If you would be willing to grant that kind of thing exists, what is that sort of thing, and what is an example of that? So give yourselves like 15 seconds to think of something there. One case of what you might be willing to consider a religious innovation. And then in that case, you see something that the concept of innovation can actually help us see that we would lose if we didn't use that term. Right, if we just talked about change or adaptation or renewal, does innovation actually give us any traction on anything at all? And it's fine if the answer is no. So give yourselves another 10 seconds or so, think of a case, and think of these conditions under which the concept is actually helpful. And then here's the innovation in practice. You're going to turn to one or two people around you. If you don't know each other, introduce yourselves. And for maybe 5 minutes or so, I want you all to have a conversation on this. And our panelists can do that among our panelists. So then we'll circle back, get some of your ideas, some of your questions, and then we can interrogate our panelists as well. But as I said, we're not all innovation experts. We're all trying to learn, figure out what's happening here. So about 5 minutes or so, if you could turn to one or two people next to you, come up with, is there a case of what you would consider innovation, and what can the concept help us see that maybe we would miss otherwise? So, there we go.
I guess we'll Thanks for your talk.
All right, if you could wrap up your discussions in a couple of seconds. So I want to hear maybe a couple of comments from the audience. Maybe if there are any interesting ideas that emerge from your discussion that could then be posed as questions or comments to our panelists. Yes. So let me move down the mic here. There we go.
Yeah, thanks. Teresa Quinchagrosa. I work in Mendoza College of Business here. And I've also had experience in working in startups and in venture capital, and a big concept that came out in that space, as they always like to say, was first mover, that the innovator is the first mover. And so in thinking about how religion, and in particular Catholicism, because that happens to be my space, is the fact that in terms of being innovators, I think it's helpful to think of ourselves as innovators in Catholicism because we have created so many goods in the world through this fullness of truth that we've had, and yet if we come into this kind of fear of the word innovation or the concept of innovation, then we become reactive only, and we become respondent to, okay, AI, well, here's what we have to say about it, and we have something to say about it because of our tradition, but it's only half of it, because we have so much more to offer in the sense that it was the church fathers who brought up concepts that never really were thought of until the Enlightenment by, let's say, secular thinkers or non-Catholic. So just, I think the word innovation can really be helpful for the church to embrace if we're thinking of ourselves as first movers, with also, as Pope Benedict would have said, the stream of tradition coming behind us and going forward. So I don't know if that's a question, but
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, maybe Tim, do you have a follow-up there?
disagree with me.
I was the opposite. So I'm Tim O'Malley at Notre Dame. I mean, I have to admit, part of it seems like a thing by Templeton to put an in-fad word next to something else. Right? You know, we use as an example St. Francis, right? And, you know, say, okay, he's an innovator, right? Except, why use the term innovation? He's an eruption, right, from the particularities of his own religious tradition. And if he thought of himself as an innovator, what would he do? Like set up a 501c3? Francis erupted out of a sense of truth, right? A reclamation of a vision of poverty and life. And I have to admit, and even listening to the panelists, John was sort of talking about innovation, right? But external innovation and the church's relationship to innovation. But there just seems so much richer terminology than innovation that isn't sort of grounded in a kind of like consumerist paradigm where that which is new immediately becomes old the moment that the iPhone 35 comes into existence.
Yeah, that's great. Sir, maybe you have a question there? And, yeah, thanks, Tim. That's a helpful provocation. And then after your question, we'll get to the panel.
Sure. This is also a response, provoking response. I suppose in defense of Templeton, defense of innovation.
To be clear, they're not wedded to the term. In fact, the inclination is to disregard the term. So
sure. Well, I wouldn't want to disregard it because it has stable social, productive, stable social use in patent law, especially, right? What's new, innovative, and non-obvious are what the signs say, right? And there's a community, there's a process. A patent officer is the person who makes a judgment based upon research that's done to show newness and to make a case for non-obviousness, right? And innovation, right? So it's got to be something that nobody has done, that can be gotten across to ordinary practitioners in a community, says an expert practitioner from that community. That's what I understand a patent is. There is a whole SBIRs. So small business innovative research grants are written across the whole fabric of federal funding. Every federal agency has one. I've reviewed for 100 of them for NSF or so. And there, it's quite clear what they're looking for, right? They're looking for an argument that here's something risky that has not been identified before, that is not being pushed forward before, and has a pathway, an identifiable pathway to very significant change. And what kind of change depends on whether it's in education or whether it's in, whether it's in some scientific discipline, et cetera. So there's a well-established reference to that, it seems to me. Now, what's that got to do with religion? How would that be in religion? I'm certainly working on something that I would hope would be innovative if you simply took McIntyre's account of what makes an entity Thomistic. It would be holistic, theoretical and practical, unified, rational engagement between kinds of communities that don't generally exist now, but have existed and could exist again. And if that were the case, then we would be doing, some communities would be doing, what Aquinas was doing, on McIntyre's reading of him anyway, which is confronting the scientific account of the day that was an arrival scientific account to one on which the tradition in Europe, right, that Neoplatonic tradition grew up with. And this is an account, an Aristotelian account that came over from the medieval scholars, and that was an attempt to come up with a new unified account for the day, and it required a kind of innovation, and Aquinas was an expert in it, trying to show both kinds of practitioners that they had to become like the others, only, and both of them in some new way. That's Aquinas's, McIntyre's account of Aquinas, highly innovative.
Mm-hmm. Great.
We
Thank you.
need-
Those are very helpful. Yeah, thank you. Very helpful provocation. So I want to have our panelists respond, I suppose, in terms of whether you would still see, based on your own discussion, based on the cases you thought about, based on your presentations, and any of these concerns that have come up about whether, for instance, does it make sense in a world in which actors are increasingly starting to see themselves as innovators, social innovators, spiritual innovators, et cetera, whether this term will then start to be more valuable for scholarship, or whether it's really better to think about other kinds of concepts for a variety of reasons. And so perhaps we'll go in the reverse order. So we start with Atalia, and John, and then Sarah, and Gabriel. And
yeah, thank you. I appreciated the provocations. I'm very much, I'm immediately compelled, Tim, by your point about Pope Francis, disruption. And I was immediately kind of thinking about how, after Laudato Si, he invited someone like Naomi Klein, who is Jewish, secular or atheist, activist, public intellectual, and in order to talk about, Laudato Si and so create that space. So I think it speaks to the issue of also the ethics of relationality that may need to kind of frame the conversation, and within that frame, think of, because it was the Templeton thing, you want to think of religion. Religion is a force for good, which is something that, I've also problematized in that kind of like the underlying frame where somehow you have all those other forces, and good religion, again, kind of going to that discourse of authenticity, will somehow, put constraints on that or point us in a good direction. Whereas, in fact, the challenge is to see how religion intersects with all those structures of violence, ideologies, including technofuturism and so forth. So I think that in terms of, Brandon, the question that you posed about innovation, I also, I would not be, it's something that I feel very anxious about using, but what is critical is to think to think through that notion of the reclaiming, but a reclaiming that is not about authenticity, reclaiming something authentic, because that can be kind of that flirts and participates in this like golden age kind of discourse that doesn't allow space for history, and also doesn't allow space for, power analysis has to be in place on all those levels. So in terms of what I was talking about with what it means to reimagine and reclaim the Jewish tradition from the genocidal catastrophe of Gaza, beyond, of course, what I, as a Jewish Israeli, owe to Palestinians. Kind of the methodology, the thinking is, and I connect to Judith Blaska's work, a feminist philosopher, standing again at Sinai, because she wants to say, well, coming with a feminist lens to Sinai, to the moment of the kind of the birth of the tradition, so the moment of origin, let's say, and say, well, I'm going to read the tradition through the silences, through the margins, through kind of this epistemology from the margins. And so when we talk about reclaiming, I think that we need to also be careful about not participating in kind of like, actually doing kind of the opposite, like reclaiming structures of power and domination, and not foregrounding the margins and the most, like not doing epistemology from the margins. So this would be kind of my words on that.
You all could try, somehow if you could try 60 seconds each.
All right, 60 seconds. So thank you, Teresa and Thomas and Tim. I mean, in some sense, I agree with all of you, right? So one thing that had been on my mind is that, in some sense, the church has always been at the forefront of innovation, whether we like the term or not, right? Pope Benedict XVI, I think, in a letter to introduce World Youth Day in 2005, has this nice phrase where he says, the saints are the true revolutionaries, and you mentioned St. Francis coming along and erupting on the scene, right? So what are they doing? Well, they're clearly doing something new, right? I mean, the mendicant movement, the monastic movement, we kind of talked in our little discussion here about these moments in the church where you do see something new, right? A new mode of being, a new mode of existence, but where's it coming from, right? It's coming from a living tradition which in this particular moment seeks to confront certain challenges. And the church in that sense has kind of always been at the forefront of innovations, whether it's corporations, the very origin of the word is essentially institutions for the poor that were run by the church in ancient Rome, corporatio coming from corpus, right, seeing this necessity of the body of Christ having a certain responsibility in the world for the whole body of the society they live in. Universities, hospitals in the medieval era, right, credit unions, cooperatives, these are all, I would argue, things that not exclusively, but in large part originated at various moments in the church, right? So I would call them innovations in that sense. And I think there's positive signs today. In some sense, though, and please don't steamroll over this if I say this, but I think the church in some sense needs to be more like Silicon Valley, right? I don't think the innovation that's changing the world today is necessarily coming from the church, right? It's coming from maybe the people that religious people are a little bit worried about, right, are creating all these disruptive technologies. So in that sense, I think Catholics, at least, there are signs, at least in the last decade, through things like Hallow or Magisterium AI, rethinking diocesan structures, Cent Ventures, Catholic worker homes trying to come up with new models of cooperative credit and loans, et cetera. I think people are thinking about these issues, but I think there's a lot of work to be done among Christians, at least, who want to engage in the world today in a way that I think the church has historically done. But I think it's not a matter of inventing new programs, right? It's a matter of trying to more fully live into our identity, because if you know who you are, right, then you're going to constantly, like perhaps these people that were mentioned, like St. Francis, be led by the Spirit in your particular day and age to contribute something new, right? Whether that's an innovation or a reclamation in a new way, in a new mode and method and art today. I think I've gone over 60 seconds. I'll just stop there, but I agree.
Am I next? Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to sort of, I guess in a way push back against what I said in my remarks, or not push back, but I don't think that the idea of returning to the past or retreating the past, again, as Atalia said, should be about kind of fetishizing the past. I do think there is a value to an emphasis, maybe innovation isn't the word, but an emphasis on the way that things have changed. And, I think there have been a number of things that are clear changes. The church's attitude to democracy, to religious freedom, to slavery, those are clear changes over time. We had talked about it as well, the advent of Aristotelianism and the way that reshaped the church. And so I do think there's a value on emphasizing the ways that the tradition changes, even if it is appealing to these older models to do so, to underwrite these changes. And I think the other value to it is that it acknowledges that there is a value to things outside the church implicitly, because it is responding to inputs from outside of the tradition in the case of Aristotelianism, obviously, and in these various other cases. And so I think that's important, right, to acknowledge that the church doesn't have all the answers and that it changes in kind of dialogue with developments outside of itself. And so there's this kind of difficult dialectical relationship that has to be maintained, whereby, what can we learn, what is good, in wider cultural developments, and what are the things that we need to be suspicious of because they seem like violations of core teachings. And that's obviously, where all the debate ensues. But I think, innovation isn't necessarily a bad term if it can capture that. I think the problem is the baggage associated with it, and the sense that what is new is always good is maybe the problem.
Yeah, so thanks to Brandon and to everyone. I just maybe say, since we're out of time, that this is at the heart of a really intense conversation among Muslim thinkers as well. It has a different flavor because historically the term in Arabic around, that's usually rendered into English as innovation, bid'ah, is an accusation, so it's definitely pejorative. So it has a whole different sort of vibe, that debate, and it's much more difficult to recover the Arabic word bid'ah. People do try to speak about a good bid'ah there. But just to note that this is a really dynamic debate in the Islamic world around Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and many other leading figures, political and religious.
Fantastic. And it's also interesting that countries like the UAE have adopted innovation as their sort of, they're like, this is their central motto for the next 50 years, right? Whether they're using ibtikar or istihad or some other definition. But thank you all for joining us, and please give me a hand in thanking our panelists here.